Today we're going to focus on Russian composer Ivan Wyschnegardsky, who made his mark writing music that utilized the mysterious concept of microtonality. Now, there are a lot of videos on YouTube that do a great job of introducing this concept. However, I'll be going a little deeper down the microtonal rabbit hole while showing you just how Wyschnegradsky may have been more in line with the traditional aspects of normal old tonality through his seminal mid-20th century work, 24 Preludes in 13-tone diatonicized chromaticism in quarter-tone system for two pianos. Now, this idea of microtonality as an extension of classical Western music is widely represented in the popular music world, with songs like How to Disappear Completely by the rock band Radiohead, and much of the music of the English phenom Jacob Collier. So what are these 24 Preludes by Wyschnegradsky? Well, as the name suggests, this work is made up of 24 movements, each one built on a different set of 13 notes that are taken from the 24-tone equal temperament scale. Now, this 24-note scale divides our normal 12-note chromatic scale into 24 quarter tones. And from this scale, Wyschnegradsky actually builds his own 13-note scale, which he called the diatonicized chromatic scale. I'll get into this a little bit later. Practically speaking, this required him to orchestrate the preludes for two pianos instead of one. One of the pianos is at concert pitch, while the other one is tuned 1/4 tone lower. Now, this practice of tuning two pianos a quarter tone apart is nothing new. It dates back to Charles Ives' 1925 seminal work, 3/4 tone pieces for two pianos, and continues on with pieces like Alan Hovhannis's 1974 Old Lord, Bless Thy Mountains, and John Corigliano's 1997 Chiaroscuro. Let's steer back now, though, to Wyschnegradsky's scalar invention, which, as I mentioned, he dubbed the 13-note diatonicized chromatic scale. This is derived from the scale's coexistent traits that relate to both the spatial density of the 12-note chromatic scale and the structural makeup of the diatonic scale. By spatial density, I'm talking about the number of notes in the scale itself, which is just one more pitch than the chromatic scale. And by structural makeup, I'm referring to the intervallic relationship between the diatonicized chromatic scale and the diatonic scale. In the diatonic scale, two tetrachords each comprise of a series of two consecutive whole tones and one semitone, which are separated by a whole tone. In a similar structural and intervallic fashion, the diatonicized chromatic scale contains two heptachords comprised of a series of 6 consecutive semitones and 1/4 tone, which are separated by a semitone. Therefore, the intervallic and structural integrity of these two scales become inextricably linked. So let's take a listen all on its own, a 13-note diatonicized chromatic scale that starts on the pitch C. Now that we've heard the piece's nuts and bolts, let's talk more broadly now about its overall structure. Wyschnegradsky's 24 preludes themselves are organized much like Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier and Chopin's Preludes, though of course Wyschnegradsky's version takes on a much different style. Bach and Chopin's works, for example, are structured based on the circle of perfect fits. While Wyschnegradsky's preludes are written based on a series of successive major fourths and their inharmonic equivalents that we call minor fits. For example, the first prelude is in the key of C, and then it moves on up a major fourth to the key of F semi-sharp in the second prelude, and then in the third prelude it goes up another major fourth to the key of B, and so on in the cycle of major fourths and minor fits. Each prelude's respective diatonicized chromatic scale is shown above the first system of every movement to give the musicians harmonic context. Now, I love all 24 of these pieces, but there are two that I find particularly peculiar. The first one is Wyschnegardsky's Prelude number 7, which goes like this. Here we can hear these cascading series of repeated dyads, which if you look closely at the notation are composed of major fourths and their inharmonic minor fifth equivalent, those same intervals we mentioned earlier on. Now, if we think about this in the context of the harmonic series, we can notice something quite striking. Let's count up from the first note all the way up to the 11th note. When we put the first and 11th pitch in the same octave, we actually get the same interval we've been talking about, this slightly raised perfect fourth that we've been calling the major fourth. So as we're listening to this, there is this possibility of feeling attuned with the natural properties of sound, a kind of spiritual experience that often emanates from works that take advantage of these pitches. The other movement that's really quite fascinating for me is Wyschnegradsky's Prelude number 9. For me, this piece refers quite directly to one of the most well-known classical works of all time, Chopin's Prelude number 4 in E minor. Wyschnegradsky begins his prelude with 2 measures of this floating 8th note ostinato centered around perfect fourths and fifths, as well as those major fourths and minor fifths that I mentioned earlier on. The pitches that comprise these intervals are A flat, A semi-flat, A natural, D semi-sharp, E flat, and E semi-flat. This is succeeded by the following 2 measures which continue the ostinato, whereby adding a 4-voice harmony moving in a seemingly irregular pattern in the bottom staff. Though the chordal language is entirely different than Chopin's, the voice leading is eerily similar from a visceral perspective. For example, the 3rd chord of measure 3 leads into the 1st chord of measure 4, in much the same manner that Chopin does between the 2nd harmony of measure 2 and the 1st harmony of measure 3. The non-chord tones of the harmonies themselves also directly relate to each other in terms of their relationship to the key of each respective prelude. For example, when examining the 2nd harmony of measure 2 in the Chopin, the E flat stands out as the note that does not belong, acting as the flat 1 of E minor. Coincidentally, the A semi-flat in the last chord of measure 3 in the Wyschnegradsky example acts as a quarter flat 1 of this prelude's intended key of the diatonicized chromatic scale based on the pitch A flat. The main difference, however, is that the E flat stays constant in the Chopin example, whereas in Wyschnegradsky, the A semi-flat slides down to G semi-sharp in the following measure. So let's first listen to the Chopin excerpt in its entirety. And then let's compare that to the Wyschnegradsky excerpt. To make an even more cogent argument about the inherent relationship between these 2 passages, let's talk about the rhythm. In this case, the rhythm forms the connective tissue between these 2 preludes. Each chord change in the Wyschnegradsky is rhythmically attached to those of Chopin in relation to the stress of the meter. For example, Wyschnegradsky's 2nd chord in measure 4 lands on an upbeat that resolves to a downbeat on the next chord in that measure, just as its analogous chord on beat 4 of measure 3 in the Chopin passage leads directly to the downbeat chord on beat 1 of measure 4. As in Chopin's 4th prelude, this pattern pervades Wyschnegradsky's 9th prelude throughout the whole piece, solidifying their relationship to each other on a structurally macroscopic level, rather than what could have been possibly a mere coincidence of influence. All this goes to show is that to accept the sounds of Wyschnegradsky, it becomes a worthwhile exercise to relate it back to traditionally tonal music, like that of Chopin, or even further back to Bach. An analysis of the Wyschnegardsky Preludes certainly becomes a more enriching exercise when thinking about the piece in this way, and becomes even more so when coupled with analysis by scholars like Miles Skinner, who wrote this 2006 dissertation that unveiled deep mathematical properties about this music. While I believe the rigor behind the sound is not intrinsically necessary for a listener to appreciate the purely musical landscape this artist evokes over 24 short preludes, an appreciation can hopefully be attained by creating connections that could have been consciously or perhaps even coincidentally built into the work. In this way, I hope that these preludes can open new perspectives for listeners while also being able to relate it back to some kind of formal tradition. Anyway, that's all for me today. Please let me know in the comments below what you think about all these conjectures. And if you thought the video was interesting, consider gently nudging that like button. And if you want to see more videos from me, consider subscribing to the channel and ding that notification bell. See you next time and take care of yourself.